Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very warm welcome to you all on this special Sophia TV show when we cover the philosophies and practices of Hajj itself. I'm joined today by our respected Hajj expert, Sayyid Ali Raza Rizvi. And so without any further delay, I would like to welcome the Sayyid to the show. Sayyidina, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you today?
Alhamdulillah.
So dear Sayyid, today it's a bit of a technical show because we're going to focus upon the doubts and possible rectifications of a person's mistakes during Umrah Al-Tamattu. So to begin with, Sayyida, what happens if a person doubts the number of tawaf he's doing? And there's a sequence involved, a mawala. So if a person loses that or doesn't pay attention to it, he does the sa'i first and the tawaf later, again, what would happen in that instance?
If a person misses out on a first part, which has to be, because you see, Hajj has two things that you have to follow, the sequence. So you cannot do sa'i before tawaf.
Yes.
So if a person performs sa'i and then he performs tawaf, his tawaf is fine, and then he has to do the 2 rakat prayers, and then he must do sa'i again.
Okay.
And mu'alat is that without gap. For example, if a person has performed the tawaf and he's performed the 2 rakat prayers, but then he has left a day, 1 day's gap between the tawaf, 2 rakat prayers and the sa'i.
Yes.
Then he, so that gap is not permissible. So he has to do within that same day, he can take a small break, let's say half an hour or something, have some zamzam, rest a little and then perform his sa'i. But he cannot give a too long gap, like hours, many hours. So he has to perform things one after the other. So
a reasonable gap is fine, just like you mentioned, a sip of water, because it tends to be quite hot as well. So.
Yes.
Okay. And what about the 2 rakat namaz behind Maqam Ibrahim? If he doubts in that prayer itself, what can he do in that sense?
There can be 2 or 3 different types of doubts. So, many different types, but once he's praying towards Kaaba and Maqam Ibrahim is between him and Kaaba. So he doubts that did he pray 1 rakat or 2 rakats, he has to pray again.
Okay. And what if it's a major doubt? For example, did I pray 2 rakats or 1 rakat? And he remembers this at the end of his sa'i. Does he have to pray again and then perform the sa'i again? Or is it okay?
If he knows, if he was only a doubt, then it's okay. But if he knows that he has made the tawaf wrong or the prayers wrong, then he has to perform those again.
Okay.
If the tawaf was wrong, he has to perform the tawaf again. If the prayers were wrong and the tawaf was correct, then he has to perform the prayers again. He doesn't have to do the tawaf. But then if his tawaf was wrong, then he has to do the prayers again as well.
Okay, I see now.
Even if the prayers were right. But because his tawaf was incorrect, then those 2 rakats were not the 2 rakats for the tawaf. He has to now perform the full tawaf and then also the 2 rakats and the sa'i.
Okay, I see. So it's best to always be a bit careful in your approach.
Because Hajj is a bit difficult.
Yes.
I don't want to frighten the people, but Hajj is a very difficult ibadat. But it is very enjoyous ibadat. It is an ibadat that develops you psychologically, spiritually. And so one has to be very careful in performing all of the actions when they're in Hajj.
Mm-hmm. And certainly I think the rewards are much more than we can imagine, so why not?
Al-Hajj al-Mabrur laysa lahu jaza'un illa al-Jannah. In the hadith, it says that for a Hajj, which is purely done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with all proper actions, there is no reward for it except for the paradise.
SubhanAllah. SubhanAllah. And just coming back to the ihram itself, due to the heat sometimes, if a person is performing the tawaf, he might be in a bit of a rush. What happens if his ihram falls apart? God forbid. What can he do in that sense?
Okay, so usually men have 2 pieces of clothing.
Yes.
So if the top part of the ihram comes off, and they have to try and still relocate and wear it again.
Yes.
And if they can't find it and they've completed their tawaf without the top part, then their tawaf is fine. However, if it was the bottom part, then they have to perform the tawaf again. They have to go and search for it. And sometimes someone else may have dropped their ihram, and you cannot just take someone else's ihram, because that ihram is not mubah for you. That is not permissible for you to use because it is someone else's property, and you have not taken permission from that person to use their ihram. Therefore, you will not, your tawaf will not be valid. You will have to get your own ihram to perform your tawaf in that ihram.
Certainly. Okay, I see.
So you're still in the state of ihram, even though you don't have the clothing. The state of ihram is that you cannot do certain things. Things like, for example, looking in the mirror is haram. So even though you've lost the pieces of clothing, you're still in the state of ihram. So all of those things still apply to you. You have to find new pieces of clothing and you just wear them again. Or for example, if your ihram had become najis and you change it, or your ihram, so whatever happens, when you changing it, it's only mustahab to renew your intention, but you're still in the state of ihram and you have to continue with performance of your actions.
Perfect, certainly. And in this respect, they say, what if a person is quite tired during the tawaf? Can he take a bit of a break in between? So maybe he's performed 4, take a bit of a break and then continue with 5?
Unfortunately, he cannot take a break during the tawaf unless it is extremely necessary and it has become unbearable for him to continue with his tawaf. Only then he can, after the 4th round, take a break. But generally he cannot. He has to perform the complete tawaf in one go. And if there comes a break because he either loses his ablution, his wudu, or because the prayer has started, or because of a slowdown in tawaf and then his ihram had become najis and he has to go and wash it, then if it was before the 3rd round, he has to begin the tawaf again.
Okay.
But if it was after the 3rd round, some scholars say 3rd, some say 3.5, some say 4.
Yes.
So you have to make sure that you have done at least 3, depending on which marja you follow.
Yes.
Otherwise 4, you have to have completed. And then you can take a break and then come back and start at Hajr Aswad again. So for example, you had completed 4 and you are in the 5th round. Before completing the 5th round, you break your wudu, something happens. You renew your wudu and then you come back and start the 5th round again.
From the start again, from Hajj Aswad. Okay. So they say, what about if a person at the end of his Umrah Al-Tamattu, so he's done his taksir, he makes some minor doubts in his mind about, my sa'i wasn't proper or my tawaf wasn't proper. What can a person do then?
If a person has doubts after completing his tawaf, he will not pay attention to any of those doubts. Because once you complete your Umrah, then you do not go back and listen to the doubts. It's only when you are certain that you have made a mistake, then you have to pay attention what sort of mistake you've made. Sometimes you can just ignore those mistakes, and some mistakes you have to go and rectify again.
Okay, and I think we've mentioned a couple of them in terms of the tawaf itself and the wudu aspect. They said, again now, in terms of the miqat, when the person ties the ihram initially, again, in this instance, if a person enters the miqat and he leaves, but he realizes perhaps my ihram is not clean, the bus can't stop anywhere now because he's left the miqat. What does he do then? Does he take a taxi back himself, or what can he do?
If his ihram was perfect at the time of miqat and only later on some problems have occurred, then he can just rectify them.
Okay.
However, if there was a mistake in his original ihram at the time of performing the ihram in miqat, then he has to go back to perform the ihram again. And if he cannot, then he turns his Hajj into Hajj Ifrad. Okay. And that way he will complete his Hajj and his Hajj will be okay.
Okay, I see. And in regards to if a person now, he's reached towards the end of the Umrah, he's about to go to Arafah, but there's no time now because he realizes, okay, my tawaf wasn't correct in my Umrah, or I didn't pray the 2 rakats, but now it's the night of the 9th of Dhul Hijj. What does he do? There's no time now. What does he do with this doubt?
With his
the wajib aspect itself, what does he do? Does he go back to the Kaaba and perform his tawaf again for the Umrah and then go to Arafah, or what does he do in this instance?
So he remembers that during his ihram for Hajj Tamattu that he had mistakes in Umrah Tamattu.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, if he has, because you see, unfortunately, and this is a very technical question, unfortunately, if he remembers at a time, because Hajj is at special dates.
Yes.
And so if you miss out any of the arkan of Hajj, like for example, Maidan Arafat or something like that, and then your Hajj will not be acceptable. So if he remembers too late, because he has to now go off to Maidan Arafat or something like that,
yes,
then he may have to rectify those mistakes later.
Yes.
However, if he remembers and he has enough time to rectify a mistake of his tawaf, for example, of Umrah Al-Tamattu, then he will have to rectify the mistake and then go off to the Maidan Arafat. One of the other things that he can do is that if he does not have enough time for rectifying his mistakes of Umrah Al-Tamattu, then the other thing that he can do is that if he doesn't have time, then that he changes his intention into Hajj Ifrad, and then he would basically perform Hajj Ifrad and not Hajj Tamattu.
Okay.
And that way he will complete his Hajj.
Okay, so there are some ways of correcting these mistakes.
There are always solutions to the mistakes you make. It is not the end of the world.
Alhamdulillah.
Some places you make penalties, some places you change the intention, some places you rectify. But they will always go and discuss the issue you have. That's my advice to all of the Hajis. Once you're on Hajj, don't say, okay, I've made a mistake, that's it. My Hajj is now ruined. I have to come back next year. Quickly go and discuss it with an expert of Hajj who would rectify your mistake or who would tell you what are the solutions and what are your options.
Certainly, they say it. And now if you come back to the beginning again a little bit, so when he's gone to the miqat, he's put his ihram on and he says the talbiyah. Now, within the talbiyah, his pronunciations might not have been perfect. There's a certain way of saying it in 3 different stages. He says it in 4 or 5 because he can't pronounce. What would a person do in this instance?
He would, you see, the most important thing is that he tries to learn it.
Yes.
If we're going to Hajj. If he doesn't, then he has another person who performs it, who makes him perform it. If he can't, then he would say it to the best of his knowledge, and another person also says it on his behalf. And if he remembers later that he, had made mistakes in performing talbiyah, then if he had performed it to the best of his knowledge at the time, then it is fine.
Perfect. And they say it in this respect regarding the ihram itself. We know it can't be stitched and you can't apply perfume to it. But what if a person during the tawaf notices that by mistake, whilst it was in his suitcase or something, there was some perfume that might have spilt onto the ihram, or he realizes that it's been stitched or sewn together in some parts. He's only just realized this now during his tawaf. Does he break it, go buy a new one, or get a new ihram and come back? What can he do?
Okay, now so certain things that, if they are not permissible, and he realizes during the ihram, during the tawaf,
yes,
then he has to, he can complete his tawaf and get a proper ihram and then come back and perform the tawaf again. But if a person has only perfume or something like that, then he can complete. And if it is on his ihram, if he's completed 4 rounds, then he can go and wash it and then come back and continue.
yes.
But if he cannot, then he has to wash it, come back and restart his tawaf.
Okay. And just a final question on this point, dear Sayyid. If a person realizes that right at the end, when he's finished everything, he's taken the ihram off, he thinks he's now discharged the obligations, but then he realizes another crucial mistake, regarding the tawaf or the 2 rakat prayer behind Maqam Ibrahim, does he then again put on his ihram, time permitting, and go back and perform those argans, or what does he do?
So he is sure that he's made mistakes.
Yes.
Depending on what sort of mistakes he's made. Now, if he had performed it without wudu, for example, the tawaf, then that tawaf is not valid. Yes. So unfortunately, he'll have to go back with ihram to perform the tawaf again and the 2 rakat prayers to rectify his umrah. Depending on what sort of mistakes they've performed, some of those can be, he has to go back, and some can be overlooked. Some are minor mistakes, then it will be okay. But if something like without wudu or without tahara, or the dress or the clothing or the body,
yes,
did not have tahara, that he has to go back and in ihram perform the tawaf and the 2 rakat prayers again.
And just before we finish, Sayyidina, I remembered one crucial question. Can we perform the tawaf on the 1st floor, 2nd floor, or does it have to be on the ground floor?
The tawaf has to be on the ground floor because mataf in the original time, there were no 1st and 2nd floors. So it has to be performed on the ground floor.
Certainly. Dear Sayyid, that's all we had the time for today. As always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time, your efforts, and your clear explanations. Our dear viewers, thank you once more for joining us as a family, both you and I and the dear Sayyid, as well as our dear brothers performing their rituals as we speak. We ask you all to remember us in your du'as, your prayers. Stay safe. Until next time, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.